Tonight, we explore the harsh and resilient lives of medieval peasants, ordinary people who endured some of the most unforgiving winters in history. With clever insulation methods and communal sleeping habits, they managed to survive through sheer determination and resourcefulness. Their lives were a testament to perseverance in the face of relentless cold. Imagine this: a tiny hut made of mud and sticks, its walls so thin you could hear sounds from outside. No insulation, no real windows, maybe just a small hole covered with animal hide. Inside, it was only slightly warmer than the freezing temperatures outdoors. When night fell, darkness took over, wind screamed through every gap, and the fire barely warmed whoever sat closest. If you were further away, you might as well have been outside. Their clothing offered little relief. Rough wool tunics, cloaks that smelled like livestock, and the hope that layering would help, though it rarely did. Bedding was straw-filled sacks with some old rushes, and the occasional flea thrown in. The cold was more than a discomfort, it was a threat. Frostbite and hypothermia were constant dangers, especially for children and the elderly. Waking up alive was a victory in itself. Their homes were drafty by design, constructed from wooden frames plastered with mud, straw, and dung. These materials, while cheap and accessible, did little to stop the icy winds from infiltrating. Roofs made of thatch sagged, leaked, and sometimes let animals drop in from above. Windows, if present, were minuscule and covered with hides or shutters. Floors were often just packed dirt, turning into mud when moisture seeped in, making every step a soggy ordeal. Yet these people endured. They filled cracks with moss, stuffed rags into holes, and relied on body heat to stay warm. Ingenuity, determination, and whatever resources they had kept them going through winter's worst. Materials like mud and goat hair were involved, something you might laugh about, assuming your teeth weren't chattering too hard. Beyond the biting cold of the air, medieval peasants also contended with an insidious chill rising from the ground. What passed for a floor was just a slightly leveled patch of earth inside the home. If you were fortunate, someone had scattered straw or old rushes to create the illusion of comfort. But in reality, you were just one thin layer away from the frozen dirt below. That cold didn't just linger, it crept upward like a malevolent spirit, snaking through whatever meager bedding you had and embedding itself deep into your bones. Dropping anything onto the floor on a winter night essentially meant losing it to the permafrost. Peasants tried to combat this by laying thick mats of straw, provided they could afford it, or swipe enough from nearby fields unnoticed. This created a temporary barrier, but straw compressed quickly, grew mold, and contributed a constant crunching noise to already restless nights. Others used dried rushes, occasionally tossing fresh layers over the old without cleaning them out. Over time, this turned into a layered mess of rotting vegetation, fleas, and who knows what else. It was a kind of primitive carpet padding, if carpets were alive, damp, and smelled like wet dogs. Beds didn't offer much respite either. They were mostly simple wooden frames stuffed with straw or hay. No real mattresses, just lumpy, poking layers that offered minimal protection against the freezing earth. Tossing and turning wasn't for comfort, but rather a necessary motion to keep from freezing on one side. Ultimately, medieval peasants didn't beat the cold, they endured it, hoping to wake up with all their toes intact. Achieving that was considered a good night. The true centerpiece of any winter home wasn't the walls or roof, or even the mix of dirt and dung used for insulation. It was the hearth. A stubborn little fire pit was the main defense against the cold and darkness. At the heart of every peasant dwelling burned a modest fire. There was no elegant fireplace or chimney, just a ring of stones, some smouldering logs, and enough smoke to make you feel like you were being slowly cured like meat. Most homes lacked chimneys entirely, so the smoke drifted out however it could, through roof gaps, wall cracks, or straight into your lungs. Breathing wasn't easy, and neither was surviving long-term exposure to the smoke. But it had the side effect of keeping pests like fleas at bay. The hearth served many roles. It was the source of warmth, light, cooking, and evening entertainment. People gathered around it to share stories, gossip, or simply stare into the flames. Letting the fire die at night was never an option. It invited the cold in fully. Starting a fire from scratch wasn't simple. Without matches or lighters, reigniting meant striking flint against steel, praying for a spark, and nurturing it with scarce, dry kindling. Every household member had a role, tending the fire, feeding it with peat, sticks, or, if luck allowed, a rare piece of dry wood. It was a never-ending struggle against the winter's chill. The fire may have sputtered and smoked, but it was the fragile, flickering center of survival. To lose it overnight wasn't just inconvenient, it could be fatal. Add the distant sound of a howling wolf for extra motivation. People got resourceful. They learned to preserve their fire overnight, not by stashing it away in a savings account, but by carefully covering the glowing embers with a layer of ash before bed. The ash worked like insulation, keeping the coals just alive enough to rekindle in the morning. Done properly, you could uncover it at dawn, toss on some wood, and reignite a blaze without freezing. But get it wrong, and mornings became colder, and tempers shorter. This technique, called fire banking, was handed down through generations like a treasured family recipe. Everyone had their own method. Some swore by dry ash, others said a little moisture was best. Some packed it tight, others left it loose. Suggesting a different approach could spark a full-blown debate. Think of it like an early version of arguing over grill techniques with higher stakes. Still, fire banking wasn't foolproof. A gust of wind through a crack or a misstep by a wandering sheep could ruin everything. That's why some households took shifts to check the coals during the night, medieval sleepwalking to the heat source. In truth, fire banking wasn't about conquering nature, but about squeezing a few more hours of warmth out of a cold night. And if one ember survived till morning, it felt like a small victory. Back then, the more the merrier wasn't just a phrase, it was a survival strategy. When the fire was low and the cold seeped in, warmth came from people. Everyone, family, neighbors, even animals, huddled close. Personal space didn't exist. On freezing nights, it wasn't about comfort, it was about making it through. Entire households crowded into the warmest part of the home, wrapped in whatever they could find, forming a snoring, tangled mass of humanity. Children were nestled between parents, elders tucked safely in the middle, and anyone who showed up late was simply squeezed in. If you got a center spot, you stayed warm. If you ended up on the outside, it was like sleeping next to a freezer door. And heaven help the one who rolled over in their sleep and knocked someone into the cold. They'd earned themselves a frosty reputation. Beds were often shared, communal straw mattresses flattened under years of use. Cleanliness wasn't a priority, so let's just say the scent wasn't ideal. But when frostbite was the alternative, people didn't complain. Body heat was a calculated resource. Some even placed the strongest, warmest folks on the outside to shield the vulnerable in the center. Babies and elderly family members were protected like precious heat sources, but beyond mere survival, this ritual became a part of family life. Huddling together led to stories, songs, and plenty of whispered conversations under a shared blanket. So next time you're annoyed by a stolen blanket or a bed-hogging pet, remember it could be worse. You could be wedged between a snoring relative and a disapproving farm animal. Speaking of animals, winter meant sharing living space with them too. Cows, pigs, chickens, goats, anything warm-blooded moved indoors. It wasn't for fun, it was essential. Livestock added heat to a drafty house, and close quarters meant they were less likely to disappear overnight. The result? A packed, noisy, smelly shelter that was half home, half barn. Chickens roosted in corners, pigs grunted by the hearth, and cows lounged like they owned the place. It was far from idyllic. Think of being stuck on a hot road trip with someone who skipped showers, only now it's a cow, it's winter, and there's no escape. The stench by spring was intense, but people adapted. Complaining wasn't worth it. They understood one simple fact. The more bodies in the room, human or not, the better the chances of surviving the cold. Fewer frozen toes greeted people each morning. Some animals even claimed the best spots. The largest and warmest, cows, often occupied the area nearest to the family. Goats were let closer for their body heat and their knack for sneaking in regardless. Chickens settled on rafters or in baskets, while pigs made themselves comfortable wherever they pleased, often smack in the middle of the room. Naturally, cohabiting with animals came with its risks. One moment you'd be sleeping soundly, the next jolted awake by a chicken roosting in your hair or stepping into something unpleasant barefoot. Mornings in those times were anything but dull. Despite the chaos, the mess, and the occasional hoof jab, people understood the hard truth. Cold could be deadly, and a cow's warmth, whether invited or not, might just keep you alive. In the face of winter, survival trumped appearance. Clothes weren't for style, they were for survival. Nobody cared about trends. They piled on whatever they had like armor against the cold. The principle was simple. If you owned it, you wore it. Often, everything at once. A basic linen under-tunic, likely scratchy and less than fresh, a woolen tunic or two, sagging leggings, a heavy cloak, and maybe a patched sheepskin draped over the top. That got you marginally warmer and exponentially itchier. Footwear was a rarity. Many wrapped their feet in cloth or old rags and shoved them into wooden clogs. If the chill still seeped through, they just added more rags and hoped their toes stayed attached. Washing clothes, not a winter option. That meant hacking through ice at a frozen stream and waiting 2 days for anything to dry, if it didn't freeze solid first. Most accepted that smelling like smoke, sweat, and livestock was a fair trade-off for avoiding frostbite. Interestingly, the build-up of grime added a layer of insulation. This natural filth sealed in warmth, like a medieval version of a high-tech jacket, just earthier and less acceptable by today's standards. Hats, scarves, and gloves were like prized possessions. A simple wool cap could be the difference between surviving the night or waking up stuck to the wall. Gloves were often made from scraps and looked more like sad puppets than anything useful. Children were wrapped up like clumsy turnips, waddling awkwardly but retaining heat. Warmth, not fashion, was the ultimate goal. So next time bundling up feels annoying, remember? Medieval folks wore their entire wardrobe at once, looked like walking laundry sacks, and felt fortunate doing it. In their world, dirt wasn't just filth, it was function. Far from giving up, they'd perfected a survival method. The real enemy? Heat loss. Freshly washed linen, while breathable, was useless against the biting cold. That's where dirt proved its worth. With every unwashed day, grime, body oils, and mud filled the fabric's gaps, forming a wind-resistant layer. It was crude but effective weatherproofing. Smelled terrible, but it worked. Some even believed washing in winter could lead to illness, so better to keep that protective coating intact. Bathing was rare, doing laundry even rarer, and soap was saved for major events, like a visit from the bishop or your deathbed. Instead of changing clothes, people just layered on new ones over the old. Eventually, their outfits became a living archive of the past 6 weeks. Every stain was a badge of survival. Outsiders may have seen neglect, but the truth was far from it. That grimy tunic was a shield against the deadly cold. No glamour, just grit. In a world where everyone smelled, nobody noticed or cared, lifestyle in the medieval winter months was far from what modern comfort might suggest. Dirt and grime weren't signs of neglect. They were practical and even desirable. By the time February rolled around, a thick, greasy layer on your skin meant you were doing things right. Contrary to romanticized images, medieval peasants didn't spend winter nights nestled in soft feather beds beneath luxurious quilts. Their sleeping arrangements were far more basic, often a wooden frame if they could afford it, topped with a sack stuffed with straw, hay, or old rushes. There were no plush mattresses or ergonomic pillows, just a crackling, uneven pile that smelled faintly of farm life. With every move, the straw rustled and sharp pieces poked through, sometimes prompting people to forego a bed frame altogether and sleep directly on the dirt floor with straw, embracing what might now be called a nature-connected experience. These makeshift straw mattresses were temporary at best. They flattened quickly, absorbed moisture, attracted bugs, and turned into a health hazard. Replacing the straw was a chore done only a few times a year, if at all. Rushes offered another option, sometimes layered with herbs like rosemary or lavender to combat the pungent smells of daily life. The pleasant aroma didn't last long, though. Soon, the rushes blended into the floor, along with dirt, food waste, and anything else that wandered in. And then there were the pests. Straw bedding was a haven for fleas, lice, and other vermin. If you woke up itching, you were experiencing an authentic medieval night's rest. Yet these uncomfortable beds were essential. Straw helped insulate against the cold ground, and huddling together created shared warmth, primitive but effective heating. Homes were built from little more than mud, sticks, and determination, which meant they did little to stop the winter wind. Cold air seeped in from every direction. To battle it, people stuffed gaps with moss, straw, cloth scraps, and anything remotely insulating. Some even smeared extra mud and dung on their walls to keep out the chill. Roofs made of thatch were leaky, so peasants patched holes with cloth, reeds, or even turf from nearby fields. Over time, homes began to resemble patchwork creations of survival. If a house had doors or windows, they were rudimentary. Rough planks barely held together, with window holes sometimes covered with animal hides or fat-soaked cloth to block drafts and bring with them a strong odor. Each night became a contest between human resourcefulness and the creeping cold, which always seemed to find the one unsealed gap. Despite the relentless conditions, medieval people endured. Through constant patching, layering, and adapting, they managed to survive winters with sheer perseverance. Even nighttime rest was strategic. Families slept in shifts. While some tried to sleep under worn blankets and hay, others kept the fire burning and battled the cold drafts. It wasn't an organized rotation, just a desperate, functional response to harsh realities. To snatch a few desperately needed hours of half-frozen rest, someone always had to tend the fire. If left alone, it would die out, and reigniting it was about as pleasant as coaxing a mule to dance. So keeping watch over the embers became necessary. Since nobody wanted to crawl out from under their scant warmth once settled, families took turns. You'd nap for a while, get nudged awake, then shuffle over to the hearth to stir the fire back to life, careful not to trip over a goat in the process. The routine was far from romantic. There were no gadgets, no midnight snacks, and certainly no snooze buttons, just aching limbs, heavy eyes, and mounting annoyance toward the loudest snorer. Children who could wield a stick were drafted in, learning early that survival meant everyone contributed. Elders often lingered by the fire, partly due to experience and partly because their joints made getting up a slow ordeal. And when it was finally your time to sleep, rest was far from guaranteed, with people moving around, animals rustling, wind shaking the walls, and the occasional jab from a sibling rolling too far. Good rest was rare, yet the method held. Shifting sleep meant the fire stayed alive, and so did the people. In those cold, relentless nights, peasants didn't just rely on cloaks and fires, they even modified how they breathed. Drawing deep breaths through the mouth invited icy air into the lungs, a real threat in a time when illnesses like pneumonia could be deadly. Instead, people learned to breathe shallowly, slowly, and strictly through the nose, warming the air a bit before it hit the lungs. If you slipped and inhaled a gulp of cold air, you might be coughing up your insides for days with nothing but home remedies and determined prayers to help you. Some covered their mouths with fabric while sleeping, creating a makeshift barrier. It wasn't glamorous, you'd wake up with a damp cloth stuck to your face, but it was better than freezing internally. Children learned this early. Parents would scold them for open-mouth breathing indoors during the winter. Between that, scratchy wool layers, and sharing space with smelly livestock, winter toughened kids up in ways few modern problems could. At night, buried under cloaks next to a steaming cow, breathing became a fine art, slow, shallow, nasal, and as minimal as possible. It was like a harsh medieval version of controlled breathing exercises, just without the calm music and affirmations. And in this nightly war with the cold, another unlikely ally emerged: food. A full stomach was a quiet but effective tool against freezing. The body burns energy to digest, generating heat in the process. So a heavy, hearty meal before bed was a survival tactic. Root vegetable stews thick with turnips, onions, and parsnips were common. Grains like oats, barley, or dense rye bread helped too. On rare lucky days, there might be some salted pork or dried sausage in the pot. These meals weren't about taste. They were heavy, filling, and deliberately slow to digest, serving as internal fuel to fight the cold. It wasn't about quantity alone, but about choosing food that kept the body warm from the inside out. Digestion offered a slow, consistent source of warmth, Foods rich in fat were especially valued, not only for their caloric content, but because fat burns more slowly than lean meats. A stomach full of stew, bread, and a generous portion of lard was considered the height of winter comfort. Parents ensured even the most finicky children ate well. Preferences didn't matter. If turnips were on the table, they were eaten. The alternative was spending the night cold and regretting your choices. It was a strict but practical approach to parenting. Of course, eating heavily at night came with its drawbacks. While it helped keep the cold at bay, it also meant risking a night of strange and vivid dreams, courtesy of a gut working overtime to digest an excessive amount of cabbage. Still, it was a price worth paying. Survival was the goal, not gourmet dining. Going to bed full, a bit uncomfortable, and next to a warm animal was simply part of getting through another frigid morning. Before modern heating, people had to get creative to stay warm at night. That's where the hay box and heated stone came in. The hay box, while rustic, was ingeniously simple, a wooden box lined with hay used to keep earlier cooked food warm for hours. Stew, porridge, whatever was on hand, could be kept hot without the danger of relighting the fire. It functioned much like an early slow cooker. But warmth wasn't reserved just for food. It was discovered that a hay could also insulate heat from stones. The heated stone era began. Before bedtime, someone, often the child who lost a family debate, would heat a flat rock in the fire. Once it was blazing hot, it would be removed with tongs or a stick, wrapped in rags or cloth, and tucked under the mattress hay or at the foot of the bed, a simple makeshift heating pad ready for use. There were risks. Wrap it poorly and you might start a fire. Drop it, and winter injuries could come from more than ice. But when done right, it delivered hours of much-needed warmth. It wasn't opulence, but in a frozen home, not waking up with frost on your face counted as luxury. The hearth wasn't just for cooking, it was a lifeline. Though it could be moody and smoky, it was central to surviving the cold. Sleeping arrangements weren't about comfort, but strategy. The most vulnerable, babies, the elderly, the sick, got the warmest spots near the fire. Others spread out from there, forming human layers of insulation. This wasn't sentiment, it was survival logic. Babies were delicate sources of warmth. Elders carried essential knowledge and experience. They had to be protected. But it wasn't as simple as just being near the flames. Too close, and you risked burning your hair or clothing. Too far, and you might as well be sleeping outside. Heat distribution was uneven, with only those directly in front of the fire truly warm. The rest huddled in the limited warmth, like cold animals seeking the last ray of sunlight. If you managed to fall asleep facing the fire, you'd wake up with one side toasty and the other freezing. Animals joined the scramble for warmth too. A dog might claim the prime spot by the fire, its tail dangerously near the embers. Chickens occasionally perched on the hearthstones, softly clucking into the night like little guardians of the heat. Every pop from the fire, every glowing ember, was a quiet reassurance. You were still alive. Still warm for the moment, the peasants drifted into restless slumber, soothed by the crackling and hissing of the fire, their breaths visible in the freezing air, just outside the fire's fragile glow. It wasn't ideal, it wasn't cozy, but it was survival, clinging to life beside a bed of glowing embers. In the medieval era, enduring winter alone was a recipe for disaster, unless one aspired to become a fashionable frozen statue by January. Surviving the cold was never a solo endeavour. It was a communal effort. A disorganized, muddy, noisy cooperation where everyone's chance of making it through depended on everyone else. Peasants understood that in the depths of winter, a warm fire and a heap of straw weren't enough. If a neighbour's home went dark, it was noticed. If smoke stopped drifting from Tom's chimney, someone checked in. Not just because he might owe a debt, though that helped, but because the community's survival was tied together. Villages had unofficial watchers during the cold months, often the elderly or young, those not working the fields, who kept tabs on who was coughing too much, who hadn't appeared at the market recently, or whose home sat unnervingly quiet beneath the frost. They were the informal guardians of winter, minus safety vests, plus plenty of sheep. If a fire went out, it was nearly an emergency. A good neighbour might bring a glowing coal wrapped in rags or welcome others into their already overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant tighter quarters, but it was better than finding lifeless neighbours when spring returned. Communal food stores were critical too. During especially brutal winters, the last bits of salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables were pooled. It was grim generosity. There was little to spare, but a few shared meals could mean the difference between surviving or not. Even children played their part, carrying firewood, passing embers, delivering urgent messages. No one was too young or too weary when winter bore down. Life in a medieval village wasn't all harmony. Disagreements over land, livestock, or borrowed pots persisted. But when the deadly cold arrived, old disputes were often set aside, because survival was a shared goal and no one knew whose door the crisis might knock on next. In the harshest months, the village became a single, stubborn family. Sometimes dysfunctional, often chaotic, but always determined to endure. One muddy step, one ember, one frozen grin at a time. When the cold descended, peasants didn't just pile on more layers or feed the fire, they turned to faith. With the wind howling like wolves beyond thin walls and the fire fading to embers, every little edge mattered, including divine help. Faith wasn't confined to one day a week. It filled every icy breath. Before huddling under scratchy wool and straw, families knelt together, offering rushed prayers for warmth, for shelter, for survival. Saints were more than distant figures. They were winter's defenders. One might be called upon to ward off throat illnesses which could easily turn deadly. Another, remembered today as a bringer of gifts, was once invoked to protect homes from winter ruin. Daily survival was surrounded by superstition. Some families sprinkled holy water by the hearth at night, hoping to ward off spirits, or at least cold draughts. Others chalked symbols over doors during certain feast days, hoping luck and warmth would follow. Candles, too, had purpose. Special vigil candles, blessed by a priest or devout elder, were left burning overnight, flickering against the darkness clawing at the walls. And always there were promises whispered in prayer. Just get us through the night, and I'll be kinder, even to the one who steals our turnips. Faith was not a vague comfort, it was a vital plea. The peasants weren't asking for wealth, just enough to keep going. A little food, a bit of warmth, and one more dawn. This raw hope rose into the smoky rafters, entangled in desperate prayers, tucked into blankets that barely held off the chill. And for all their faith, resourcefulness, and grit, winter still sometimes prevailed. When it did, it didn't just claim a few, it swallowed families, entire communities, into a silence buried beneath snow and ice. Some winters were especially brutal, like that of 1315, when relentless rains ruined crops, animals starved, and the cold showed no mercy. The biting cold turned an already harsh life into an unrelenting ordeal. Desperation drove people to unimaginable extremes, chewing on leather, gnawing on bark, and, in the bleakest cases, consuming one another. Losing the fire wasn't just inconvenient, it often spelled death. Without even a faint heat from the hearth, families clung to each other in their final hours. When spring arrived, entire households were sometimes found frozen together, locked in a last attempt to share warmth. Homes could collapse under the burden of snow or the onslaught of ice storms, and a roof falling in during a frigid night was typically fatal. Trudging through snow to plead for shelter didn't guarantee safety either, particularly when neighbors had nothing left to give. Cold also brought illness. Hunger weakened bodies, and crowded, smoky homes became perfect breeding grounds for deadly ailments like pneumonia and bronchitis. A winter cough could all too easily become a funeral. Then there was frostbite, the silent menace. Limbs blackened and perished while still attached, a gruesome reminder of survival. Some emerged from the season without fingers or toes, grim tokens of endurance that silently declared, "I survived, but winter took its toll." Yet what lingers most is not the death itself, but how commonplace it became. Each year it was accepted that some would not make it through. Death was not a surprise visitor, but a constant, frost-covered companion. Still, even in the face of relentless cold and danger, people endured. They mourned, they fought, they lived. As long as a single ember glowed in the hearth, as long as breath misted in the air, there was something worth fighting for. When thinking of those who lived through these frozen ages, it's easy to focus on the suffering, chapped hands, numb feet, smoke-stained homes. But beneath the hardship lay a fierce determination and inventive spirit. They had no modern comforts, no heating, no warm clothing, no assurance of survival. But what they did possess was a raw blueprint for resilience. Every straw-filled mattress, every carefully tended flame, every gap stuffed with moss was a creative response to overwhelming adversity. They didn't surrender, they adapted. They learned from the earth, from each other, and from the punishing trials of each winter. Their communities were anchored in mutual survival. They cared for the sick, shared food when it ran low, and believed that helping a freezing neighbor today might mean being saved tomorrow. They understood that no one outlasted winter alone. Their faith was a quiet form of perseverance. They folded prayers into their routines, not only from fear, but from a stubborn hope. That the next day might bring warmth, that the spring would return, and life would stir again beneath the snow. And eventually it did. Because they endured, because they fought for one more dawn, future generations could thrive. Each small victory against the cold moved humanity forward. The warmth we enjoy today, the cozy rooms, the insulated windows, the gentle glow of indoor lights, is the result of their tireless struggle. Every comfort was earned through their endurance. So when the cold wind rattles the glass and frost coats the eaves, remember those who faced winter with little more than willpower, the unknown ones who carved a legacy out of frozen nights, one breath, one ember at a time. Anne Boleyn was not born into power or surrounded by grandeur. Around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, she entered the world as the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a determined diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with influential lineage. Her birth made little impact on the social order of the time, yet from these unremarkable origins grew a life destined to reshape the future of England. What distinguished Anne early on wasn't wealth, but intellect. She was sharp, vibrant, and undeniably captivating. Seeing her promise, her family sent her to Europe, where her real education began. She first joined the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, an opportunity rare for any English girl. There she learned diplomacy, etiquette, and the subtleties of international politics. But it was in France that her intelligence truly flourished. She spent formative years at the courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, immersing herself in the sophistication and political nuance of the time. These experiences refined her intellect and sharpened her ability to navigate power, preparing her for a future no one yet imagined. Grace, charm, and sharp intelligence defined her. While other young women refined their domestic skills, Anne honed her ability to engage, intrigue, captivate without appearing to try. By the early 1520s, when she returned to England, she was a rarity, an Englishwoman who could rival the elegance of continental courts and carried the determined ambition of a family on the rise. She didn't fit conventional standards of beauty, even her supporters admitted that, but she was unforgettable. Her dark, intelligent eyes, expressive voice, and purposeful movements hinted at a strength just beneath her polished exterior. She didn't just arrive, she shifted the atmosphere. In a time when women's lives were largely predetermined by birth and marriage, Anne resisted fading into the background. Her time abroad had taught her the influence that charm and intellect could yield, and she intended to wield that power at home. Still young, sharp, and yet to be tested, Anne was already drawing the notice of history. No longer simply her father's daughter, she returned as a key player in a game that would soon envelop the monarchy itself. When she re-entered the English court, she stood apart from anyone the nobility had encountered. In a setting filled with modest, fair-skinned young ladies, Anne was a force of nature, striking, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. Her dark features and sharp wit made her stand out amid the obedient women who surrounded the king. At first, she fulfilled her expected duties as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Yet even within that role, she drew attention like a flame draws moths. She danced with elegance, spoke French fluently, and laughed with a self-assuredness that few dared exhibit. She didn't go unnoticed. Conversations buzzed with her name. Soon she attracted the gaze that held the greatest consequence, the king's. The king was well accustomed to flirtation and romantic intrigue, but Anne stood apart. She didn't melt under his praise or rush into his embrace. She provoked, resisted, and maintained distance. Accustomed to immediate devotion, the king found himself enthralled. The more she withheld, the more he pursued. Their correspondence overflowed with passion, frustration, and desire. When he offered her the influential yet unofficial role of royal mistress, she declined. She would not be another fleeting affair. If he truly wanted her, he would have to marry her. It was a shocking proposition. He was already married. His wife, Queen Catherine, was deeply respected and protected by one of Europe's most powerful rulers, her nephew. Claiming Anne would mean challenging religious authority itself. But she remained undeterred. Her experience in European courts had taught her how women could exert power through diplomacy and charm. She knew the stakes and chose to play for the highest one. In the quiet glow of courtly halls, she resolved not simply to be admired, but to shape her own fate and that of her country. What began as a passionate pursuit soon escalated into a national crisis. The king's feelings deepened into obsession, and he was prepared to unravel centuries of tradition to claim her. The obstacle: his existing marriage to Queen Catherine, who, with dignity and strength, refused to step aside. After 20 years of marriage, she remained his lawful wife in the eyes of the people and the church. Divorce was nearly inconceivable, but he pushed forward. He convinced himself and attempted to persuade others that his union with Catherine was cursed due to her previous marriage to his brother, despite a papal dispensation. Now he insisted that his soul was at risk unless the marriage was annulled. Anne, careful and strategic, stayed slightly beyond reach, encouraging the king while maintaining her independence. Every action, every word was deliberate. She wasn't just seeking marriage, she was maneuvering toward the crown. The court fractured around her. Some families allied with her, sensing a shift in power. Others stayed loyal to the queen, appalled at the potential upheaval. Envoys sent urgent messages to Rome, foreign rulers issued warnings, and even the king's own advisors grew uneasy. As time dragged on, the king's desperation mounted. He overwhelmed the Pope with appeals, pushed his legal team to find solutions, and began to realize the resistance he faced. Queen Catherine's supporters were powerful, especially her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most influential figure in Europe. Yet undeterred, the king pressed on, defiant. Customs, long-standing practices, and now even statutes were at stake. What began as Henry's personal infatuation with Anne had grown into a direct affront to England's political and religious order. Anne was doing more than enchanting a monarch. She was steering a nation into unprecedented territory. There was no going back once this hazardous affair gained momentum. After nearly 7 torturous years of political chess, gossip, and international uproar, Anne's bold strategy triumphed. In January 1533, she married Henry VIII in secret. No small feat, since in the eyes of the Pope and much of Europe he remained wed to Catherine of Aragon. By June, she sat beside him as Queen of England, an ostentatious coronation at Westminster Abbey marking her ascent. But London's spectators were divided. Some cheered, others whispered prayers for the deposed Catherine, and many wondered if this audacious French-trained consort would prove a blessing or a curse. Anne's reign burst forth in vivid contrast to Catherine's reserved piety. She dazzled the court in striking attire, wielded her intellect like a weapon, and amassed powerful foes almost overnight. Yet her position, though seemingly impregnable, depended entirely on one critical objective: furnishing Henry with a male heir. She was no longer merely his lover, she embodied the dynasty's future. When Anne's pregnancy was announced, both she and Henry rejoiced, certain of a son's arrival. But in September 1533 she delivered a healthy daughter, Elizabeth. Anne concealed her disappointment with aplomb, promising a boy would follow. Henry, however, could not hide his doubts. The spark in his eyes dimmed. Still for a spell, Anne reigned supreme, reshaping the court, elevating her kin, and becoming the first English queen anointed with king's oil. Diplomats vied for her favour as Henry formalized England's break from Rome, crowning himself head of the Church of England, to secure Anne's position. Yet even at her zenith, ominous signs emerged. Courtiers murmured behind cupped hands, and Catherine's loyalists plotted revenge. Henry's restless nature soon drew him toward Jane Seymour, whose modest propriety stood in stark relief to Anne's fiery spirit. Desperate, Anne enticed Henry with promises of sons and pleas for patience, but the king's caprice had already turned elsewhere. Her once stalwart ally Thomas Cromwell quietly amassed evidence of treason, collecting whispers and testimonies to use against her. The Queen, who had masterminded a revolution in church and state, now faced a far more ruthless game, one where rumours and perjury, not armies, would decide her fate. At court, betrayal simmered, quiet, patient, and lethal. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's staunch supporter during the English Reformation, had turned against her. Their alliance, once fueled by shared ambition, had unravelled. Anne sought reforms to aid the poor and check the power of the nobility, while Cromwell prioritised stability, royal favour, and minimal interference. Her boldness had become a liability. Henry's affection had soured into annoyance, mistrust, and detachment. Anne's allies had dwindled. Her once enchanting charisma now clashed with the court's yearning for a gentler, more submissive consort. Jane Seymour, quiet and strategic, lingered on the sidelines, a stark contrast to Anne's diminishing flame. Cromwell acted first, sensing the king's restlessness and his desire for an escape that wouldn't tarnish his honour. Divorce was too damaging, but disgrace offered a cleaner solution. Allegations surfaced, shocking and grotesque. Adultery, incest, treason. Anne, once a proud and intelligent queen, was cast as a traitor and a seductress, a danger to the throne she had helped reshape. Cromwell meticulously built the case, extracting confessions through torture and twisting courtly exchanges into incriminating testimony. Several men, including Anne's own brother George Boleyn, were arrested. The charges were riddled with contradictions and implausibilities. But in that world, truth bent to the king's will. Anne, sensing her peril, made a final effort to reach Henry, invoking their past love, but he would not even face her. In May 1536, she was taken to the Tower of London. As the gates closed behind her, she understood her fate, no longer queen, but a prisoner in the very power game she had once mastered. Her betrayal was complete. Alone in the tower, Anne awaited the end. She stood in the great hall of the tower, facing a tribunal of nobles who owed their rank to her ascent. Now they judged her, ready to erase the legacy she had forged. The accusations were shocking: relations with multiple men, treason, even conspiracy against the king. In another context, such claims against a queen would be absurd. But here they served a purpose, a grim spectacle, to give the king what he desired, cloaked in the appearance of justice. Anne responded with the same passion that had once captivated Henry. She denied all charges with clarity, intellect, and remarkable composure. She reminded them of her divine anointment as queen, her loyalty, her sacrifices. But it was futile. The outcome had been decided before the trial began. It was all performance. Witnesses bribed or coerced, testimony riddled with inconsistencies, evidence weak or non-existent. The truth no longer mattered. Anne was declared guilty. Her brother and the other accused men were condemned as well. She was sentenced to death by beheading, a leniency in contrast to the usual traitor's fate. When the verdict came, Anne did not falter. She stood with dignity, her spirit unbroken. Before returning to her cell, she declared herself ready for death and prayed for divine mercy. As the doors closed behind her, the court felt a sense of release. The storm that had been Anne, brilliant, formidable, unforgettable, was nearly spent. But they misunderstood. They were not erasing her, they were turning her into legend. Back in the tower, Anne awaited her end not as a triumphant queen, but as a condemned prisoner. Even then she remained resolute. In the cold, echoing halls, she prayed for hours, firm in her belief that she had committed no crime. She faced death without fear, hoping it would bring peace to the realm and mercy for her daughter, Elizabeth. Her few remaining attendants grieved quietly, but Anne comforted them. She even joked with dark wit that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head. In that grim humour lay the unyielding flame that had always defined her. Meanwhile, Henry showed no mercy. Henry had already shifted his attention to Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution was officially set, he was preparing for another marriage. For Anne, this ultimate betrayal from the man who had once dismantled a kingdom for her must have been the cruelest wound. On May 18, 1536, Anne was informed she would be executed the next day. She barely slept, spending her remaining hours in prayer, asking for forgiveness for those who had harmed her, and perhaps for herself, for the ambition and pride that had led her to this point. As a final gesture, Henry arranged for a skilled French swordsman to carry out the execution, quicker and less brutal than an axe. It was a small mercy, likely meant more to ease his own conscience than to comfort Anne. At dawn, Anne carefully prepared for her final moment, wearing a dark grey damask gown trimmed with fur, with a crimson underdress, colours of dignity and sacrifice. She pinned up her hair and covered it with a simple cap, ready to meet her end with composure. As the morning mist curled through the tower's courtyard, Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, survivor, stepped forward. There were no tears or pleas, only a final display of courage in the face of fate. Her death was near, but her legacy had only just begun. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne climbed the scaffold within the Tower of London. A small crowd gathered, guards, courtiers, a few silent observers. Anne stood poised, her gown stirring in the cold breeze. She appeared thinner, her face pale but serene. She did not weep or break down. She met death with the same defiant grace that once rocked a kingdom. Her final words were brief and deliberate. She neither accused nor defended, instead offering prayers for the king's well-being, the same man who had forsaken her. In the end, she gave not a confession, but forgiveness. Even those gathered to witness her fall were struck by her composure. The French executioner, brought specifically for a swift and clean death, stepped forward. Anne knelt, hands in prayer, eyes lifted to the sky. A white cloth was tied over her eyes. She remained still. The sword struck once, silent, quick, and Anne Boleyn was gone. She was buried hastily in an unmarked grave on the Tower grounds, placed in an arrow chest because no coffin had been prepared. A queen once crowned with gold now left the world without ceremony. Yet her story didn't end there. Her daughter, Elizabeth, whose birth had once disappointed a king, would rise to become one of England's most powerful monarchs. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, would lead an era of flourishing art, influence, and strength. She inherited her mother's fierce intellect and resilience. Anne Boleyn forever altered the course of English history. Her ambition sparked the break with Rome and the creation of the Church of England. Her downfall proved even queens could be cast aside. But through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy endured, shining brighter than any crown she had worn. In the end, Anne Boleyn found a kind of immortality, not in survival, but in the lasting imprint she left on history. By the early 1770s, tensions in the American colonies had reached a boiling point. The bond with Britain, once a source of pride, had curdled into distrust, anger, and defiance. The unrest didn't start with tea. Years earlier, the Stamp Act had provoked outrage by imposing taxes on everyday items like newspapers and playing cards. This was followed by the Townshend Acts, which taxed essentials such as paper, glass, and paint. Each new law, passed by a distant parliament without colonial representation, felt like another spark on dry kindling. At first, the reaction was measured: formal petitions, fiery pamphlets, boycotts. Colonial assemblies voiced opposition, and writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson filled the press with arguments for liberty. But over time, frustration turned to disillusionment. It became clear that Britain wasn't just unresponsive, it was indifferent. Many colonists held on to the belief that enough protest would bring change. Occasionally, it did. The Stamp Act was famously repealed. But each small victory was soon followed by new laws, fresh taxes, deeper grievances. This conflict wasn't about money. The taxes themselves were relatively minor. What stoked the colonists' fury was the principle behind them: taxation without representation. They were being treated not as citizens but as subordinates, ruled from afar, not engaged as equals. Boston, more than any other city, became the center of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive and impassioned group, grew more vocal and daring. In 1770, mounting tension finally erupted into violence when British troops opened fire. Unarmed civilians had already been fired upon in what came to be known as a massacre. The streets were stained with blood, and trust had vanished. By 1773, the colonies were on the brink. A final provocation would push them into open rebellion, and it came not through troops, decrees, or armies, but in the quiet form of tea crates. The people did not yet realize that when that tea was cast into the icy harbour waters, history would be rewritten. In that year, the British government made a significant misjudgment. Believing the colonies would accept a more affordable product, it enacted the Tea Act, a measure meant to rescue a floundering trading company and reassert its right to impose taxes. On paper, the plan was sound. The act allowed direct sales to the colonies, bypassing intermediaries, lowering costs, and making a premium item cheaper by a few cents. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. The issue was never about the price, but the underlying principle. The tax on tea remained intact. To accept the shipment, even at a reduced rate, meant acknowledging the government's authority to tax without representation, a concept many in the colonies found intolerable, a betrayal of the freedoms they had defended for years. News of the act spread swiftly. Merchants saw a threat to their businesses from a monopoly that could devastate local commerce. Those fighting for self-determination saw the act as a disguised assertion of control. In one major port city already wounded by violence and economic strain, the law was immediately recognized as a trap. Rejecting the tea became a symbolic stand for freedom. Mass gatherings were held, newspapers erupted with passionate commentary, and resistance groups organized widespread boycotts, pledging that no tea would be received, traded, or consumed on colonial soil. Across the territories, vessels carrying the contentious cargo were turned away. From north to south, the message was resolute: they would not be coerced. But in that same key city, events took a different turn. 3 ships, each bearing the disputed product, arrived and refused to depart. Authorities demanded the cargo be unloaded. The populace refused. A tense standoff ensued. The city became a crucible of unrest. Each day that passed without resolution heightened the strain. The population wasn't merely resisting, it was bracing for conflict. In every gathering place, debates raged over the next step. Leaders of the resistance acted quickly, rallying support through public declarations and rowdy assemblies. One prominent meeting hall became the movement's headquarters, packed with thousands, their breath steaming in the winter air, their voices loud with defiance. Each motion passed, each refusal to submit struck another blow against imperial rule. Yet time was running out. Under existing law, imports had to be landed and taxed within 20 days. If they remained unprocessed beyond that, officials would seize them and enforce collection. Organizers knew that once the duty was paid, even reluctantly, the cause would be undermined. The struggle had grown beyond a dispute over merchandise. It was now about rights and the choice between subjugation or self-determination. The colonial governor stood firm. He would not allow the vessels to leave without unloading. To him, capitulation meant conceding control to the crowd. The standoff became a public drama. Everyone knew a climax was near. The city held its breath, sensing the approach of something momentous. And somewhere amid the throngs, a decision was quietly forming, one that would reverberate far beyond its place of origin. On December 16, 1773, under a cold and grey sky, the city awoke to a turning point. For nearly 3 weeks, the ships had waited like time bombs in the harbour. Now the legal deadline had arrived. The moment of reckoning had come. The arrival of the ship was critical. If it wasn't properly handled, customs officials had the authority to confiscate the cargo, and British troops could be summoned to enforce compliance. Everyone understood the gravity of the moment. If the tea was unloaded, the colonists would lose the symbolic fight. Allowing it to be landed even once would undermine their claims to rights and liberty. That morning, thousands from Boston and the surrounding countryside gathered at the Old South Meeting House, the town's largest venue. Some had journeyed for miles through the cold just to attend. The building overflowed with people, spilling into the streets as they strained to catch the impassioned oratory echoing from within. Samuel Adams, a leading voice of resistance, led the meeting. One speaker after another condemned the Tea Act, denounced oppression, and called for decisive action. Yet uncertainty lingered. How could they act without triggering a full-scale conflict? How could they halt the tea without inviting harsh reprisal? As the day progressed, messengers arrived with troubling updates. The governor refused to relent. The ships would remain until their cargo was unloaded. The tea would be claimed, the tax collected, the Crown's authority upheld. The crowd seethed with anger. The building itself seemed to tremble with emotion. Then Samuel Adams calmly declared, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." The meaning was unmistakable. There would be no more appeals or negotiations. Action was imminent. Outside, a piercing cry broke through the gathering darkness. The signal. Men swiftly disguised themselves, darkening their faces with soot and wrapping themselves in blankets and feathers, mimicking native attire. It was not about deception, but about making a clear statement. The time had come. Boston would respond with resistance, not rhetoric. As night fell on December 16, 1773, the quiet streets came alive. Dozens of ordinary men, cloaked and blackened, moved purposefully through the city toward Griffin's Wharf, where 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay docked. The harbour was cold, the air sharp. There were no shouts, no disorder. This was no mob. It was a calculated operation. Armed with simple weapons, the men overtook the ships, meeting little resistance from the few crew members aboard who stood aside as the plan unfolded. With practiced swings, chests of tea were split open and tossed overboard. The scent of fresh leaves filled the icy air. The water below churned as crate after crate, 342 in total, was destroyed. Onlookers watched in silence. British guards nearby did not interfere, perhaps hesitant, confused, or unwilling to provoke further escalation. Even some loyal to the crown seemed to recognize that a line had been crossed. The discipline displayed was remarkable. No one stole anything, no valuables were touched. Only the tea, seen as the embodiment of British injustice, was targeted. In a city facing real deprivation, the protest could have turned chaotic. It did not. When the work was done, the harbour was a dark stew of floating leaves and broken wood. The men melted back into the city, leaving no names, no claims, just a bold act of resistance. By morning, a strange scent of briny tea lingered over the city. Word of what had happened spread quickly by voice, letter, and printed sheet. By midday, everyone knew, and the reactions were swift and divided. Among those who supported the colonial cause, there was a deep and powerful pride. Ordinary people had dared to challenge one of the world's greatest powers in the name of freedom. But others, particularly moderates and those loyal to British rule, reacted with alarm. To them, the destruction of property was reckless and dangerous. It raised a sobering question: had the colonies gone too far? One colonial governor was infuriated not only by the damage done, but by the message it sent. If authority could be defied so openly in one city, where else might such defiance spread? Officials in Britain were shocked. They had anticipated protests, boycotts, perhaps another unruly outburst like those in response to earlier taxation, but not the calm, deliberate destruction of valuable royal cargo carried out with precision and without collateral damage. The captains of the affected ships could only look on as their cargo disappeared into the harbour. The financial loss was recorded at over £10,000, a considerable sum, but the real cost went deeper. It was a blow to the perceived legitimacy of British control. That night marked the end of mere protest and the beginning of something more serious. Tensions had reached a breaking point. When word reached Britain, the response was immediate and severe. Officials didn't see it as just another act of resistance, they saw it as open rebellion. The king was reportedly incensed. Parliament, long frustrated by colonial defiance, erupted in outrage. Harsh measures followed quickly, meant not just to punish, but to serve as a warning. The first of these was a law that shut down the port of the rebellious city, crippling its economy until restitution was made and order restored. Ships were barred, trade halted, and the once busy harbour grew silent. Further restrictions soon followed. The colony's self-government was revoked, replaced by rule from royal appointees. A new law allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried overseas, effectively shielding them from colonial justice. And to reinforce the point, soldiers were stationed throughout the city, quartered among the people they were meant to control. The message was unambiguous: dissent would be punished and authority would be enforced. But instead of breaking the spirit of the colonies, the crackdown ignited a broader outrage. Sympathy for the affected city poured in from neighboring regions. Supplies, food, and messages of support arrived in growing numbers. The harsh measures intended to isolate and intimidate had the opposite effect. What had once been seen as a local issue quickly became a shared cause. Instead of silencing dissent, the punishment transformed the city into a powerful symbol of resistance. Sparks of defiance spread, and soon a coordinated movement began to take shape. The harsh treatment had done what years of disputes had not. It had united the colonies in common purpose. For years, they had been divided by distance, faith, and competition. But the crackdown showed how fragile their rights truly were. If one colony could be targeted, none were safe. Support for the punished city surged from all directions. Meetings were held, newspapers buzzed, and the people began to prepare for a collective response. In the fall of 1774, representatives from 12 colonies met together for the first time in a significant show of unity. Influential figures, once seen as local leaders, now emerged as national voices. Their stated aim was still reconciliation, not independence. But as they debated and planned, a deeper reality set in. The colonies could no longer afford to face the future apart. They agreed to a widespread boycott and pledged mutual support against future threats. A new chapter was beginning. They declared that an attack on any one colony would be treated as an attack on all. In taverns and gathering places throughout the continent, people began to speak openly, words that were once only uttered in secrecy: unity, resistance, liberty. By striking hard at Boston, the British had hoped to extinguish the rebellion. Instead, they forged a stronger bond among the colonies, uniting them into something far more formidable, a people who, despite their differences, were beginning to see themselves not as separate territories, but as Americans. The winds of revolution had gone beyond whispers. They were turning into a storm, and it was already too late to stop it. The night the tea sank into the harbour, it wasn't just cargo that was lost. It was the belief that the colonies could remain loyal forever. That act of defiance ignited a flame no monarch, no army, no distant legislature could extinguish. In the months that followed, that spark spread across the colonies. What had once been acts of protest and formal petitions evolved into overt resistance. Militias trained openly, and supplies of ammunition and weapons grew. Men who once raised glasses to the king now whispered of revolution in the same spaces. Boston came to represent endurance, a wounded yet unyielding symbol. The more Britain tried to assert control, the more the colonies slipped from its grasp. Each vessel that passed the shuttered harbour of Boston served as a silent testament to defiance. When punitive laws were enacted to make an example of Boston and intimidate the rest, they instead turned the city into a symbol, a rallying cry. From the southern reaches to the northern territories, people came to understand that their destinies were shared. The fight was no longer just about tea, it was about existence, identity, freedom. By the spring of 1775, tensions erupted outside Boston. In Lexington and Concord, troops sent to seize weapons encountered armed civilians ready to defend their rights. The first gunfire of the revolution echoed, directly tied to the moment when a bold act in a harbour prioritized ideals over profit. That defiant act had proven that revolution doesn't always begin with grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with a small group standing in the cold, choosing resistance over fear. By discarding the tea, they weren't just protesting taxes, they were rejecting an empire. And though the journey ahead would be marked by blood and hardship, something undeniable had begun that night. The colonies were no longer merely loyal subjects. They had become revolutionaries, and their movement was only beginning. Long before the iconic pyramids of Egypt, the bustling cities of Mesopotamia, or the mysterious stones of Stonehenge, there was a place called Corral. Hidden in the arid valleys along Peru's coast, Corral rose in quiet splendor nearly 5 millennia ago, only to vanish into obscurity, buried beneath the sands and forgotten by time. For centuries, the world was unaware of its existence. The valley where Corral once thrived appears, at first, unlikely to host civilization. Its barren landscape and faint, winding river seem more suited to solitude than society. Yet it was in this austere setting that one of humanity's earliest urban centers emerged. Corral was not a scattered settlement or a simple trade stop. It was a carefully designed city spanning 150 acres, complete with pyramids, plazas, living areas, and sacred spaces. It represented purpose, organization, and ambition, a sophisticated society that predated the Egyptian pyramids. The people of Corral built it without wheels, written records, or metal tools, relying solely on cooperation, creativity, and determination. Yet for millennia, Corral remained hidden. Even those who stumbled across its weathered ruins mistook them for natural hills shaped by desert winds. Few imagined that beneath the surface lay one of the world's most ancient cities, older than many civilizations once thought to be the first. Not until the late 1900s did archaeologists led by Ruth Shady uncover the truth. What they unearthed would alter the narrative of the Americas and challenge long-held beliefs about the dawn of civilization. Corral had risen, thrived, and vanished in complete anonymity. Now its remains speak once more, telling the story of a thoughtful, peaceful people who built a complex world in an unforgiving environment, and this, as it turns out, was only the beginning. At first glance, the valley where they lived seems desolate, its sands swept by harsh winds and scorched by the sun. Yet from this unforgiving place, one of the first great human achievements took shape, scorched the land into fractured, brittle layers. Water was rare, with the river winding through like a fragile thread clinging to existence. To many it appeared lifeless, desolate, abandoned, stripped of hope. But the inhabitants of Corral perceived it differently. They saw not a threat, but an opportunity. The river, though small, was a source of life. With vision, effort, and resolve, they transformed this harsh environment into a flourishing center of life and culture. Their initial triumph was in agriculture. They harnessed the seasonal floods by creating clever irrigation systems that distributed water across the valley. Where others saw only dust and despair, they nurtured life: cotton, beans, squash, guava, sweet potatoes. Cotton emerged as a prized resource, spun into nets and cloth, fueling trade and forging connections beyond their dry homeland. Farming was just one part of their broader wisdom. The people of Corral knew that survival meant harmony with nature. Their buildings, made from stone and earth, were designed to resist both the intense heat and the rare but fierce rains. They layered wool, fur, cloaks, even kept on boots. The notion of undressing for bed would have seemed ridiculous. Clothes stayed on. Sleeping near others brought both comfort and irritation. Someone always moved, someone always muttered, elbows jabbed, knees bumped. A dog might stir unexpectedly. Still it was ordinary. Silence wasn't expected. Togetherness was. And in that closeness there was a strange sense of safety. You could hear a parent breathing, a child twitching, an elder murmuring prayers in sleep. It wasn't calm, but it was deeply human. It was shared. Dreams were taken seriously. A field of grain could symbolize abundance. A snake, sickness. A broken tooth might foretell death. People learned to read these signs or sought out someone who could. Some individuals were known in the village for their insight, unofficially. Religious leaders had their own warnings. Some dreams were believed to come from darker forces. Sleep was seen as a time when temptation might creep in. Prayers were said before bed to ward off troubling thoughts, to keep the soul ready, just in case the night was final. People went to bed and sometimes didn't wake. Illness could strike silently. Fever might rise. Coughs could worsen. By dawn, someone might have slipped away without a sound. This uncertainty gave morning a quiet sense of gratitude. When daylight returned, when the rooster called, when the coals were revived, it meant another night had been survived. People rose slowly. Every movement reminded them of their age, no matter how young. The cold stung. Faces were wiped. Eyes scanned the room. And they counted the ones who stirred. Everyone was accounted for, and those who weren't were checked on. Once it was clear who had made it through the night, the day could begin. Water was collected, bread was made, animals were tended to. If a dream had meaning, it was spoken aloud. The night's memory faded, not lost, just softened and carried forward. Winter brought long nights of sleep. Summer shortened them, but the rhythm stayed the same. First sleep, a waking hour, then second sleep. Life moved without clocks, but not without order. Despite the hardships, there was a kind of steadiness in that pace, something sincere. Comfort wasn't the goal, endurance was. And when rest came, or warmth, or a peaceful night, it was a gift, unasked for, unexpected. Some years brought hunger, others famine. They weren't the same. Hunger had rules. You could ration, stretch, plan. But famine ignored those rules. It came when the crops failed, when there was no more pretending things would improve. Food became more of a thought than a reality. Signs showed early. Spring brought too much or too little rain. Barley grew in scattered patches. Bean flowers browned too soon. Cabbages split. Wheat drooped low, as if already mourning. Everyone noticed. No one said anything, but the looks were there. And mental math began. What's left? What can we save? How little can we eat? The answers were grim. The hardest part came in summer, not winter. That was when choices had to be made, plant seeds or grind them for flour. Gamble on a harvest or feed a child another bowl. Meals got smaller, the stew thinner, bread less frequent. Bowls weren't empty, they just didn't appear as often. No panic, not yet. You told yourself others might help, that stores might stretch. Hope lingered, if little else did. By late summer, pretending was harder. By autumn, it wasn't possible. Animals ate last, if at all. Chickens quieted. Goat cries hollowed. Dogs followed closely, as if knowing their turn was coming. Bread became sacred. A single loaf split 5 ways. Crumbs were treated like treasure. Stew turned to hot water. Pot colours tinted the broth. Weeds, roots, unknown plants. Anything was tried, some safe, some not. Sleep broke in shifts, not from fear, but hunger. Children stopped asking questions. They no longer begged for stories or sweets. They just sat by the fire and learned how to wait. The village fell silent. No arguments, no laughter, only the occasional cough or crackling wood. Famine didn't harden hearts, it quieted them. Sometimes someone brought back something, a rabbit, a bird, bitter acorns. You ate it anyway, grateful for the mere presence of food. The manor gave grain on occasion, but often didn't. The steward's visit stopped. That meant he took nothing but gave nothing either. His absence spoke volumes. The church gave what it could. Bread, after prayers, a coin here or there, but they too were stretched thin. You prayed more, not always with belief, but from habit. Words were light, easier than lifting a hand. Some left the village in search of food, work, or meaning. Some came back, others didn't. You didn't ask. You were too weary. Famine reshaped you. You didn't feel your ribs from outside. They made themselves known from the inside. You moved slower, bruised easier, woke with clenched hands as if still working. Cold dug deeper. Fire became a companion. Towering above were pyramids, not tombs, but sacred structures that symbolically connected the earth with the sky. Ceremonies likely aligned with agricultural and astronomical cycles, celebrating the changing seasons and celestial events. Music was more than art. It was a sacred bridge linking humanity with the natural and divine realms. There were no violent images, no deities of war, no signs of blood rituals. Instead, chorale's spirituality emphasized harmony, joy, and reverence. Even now, when the desert wind sweeps through the ruins, one might still catch the ghostly echo of music, the lost songs of a people who found meaning and unity in a demanding landscape. Chorale was more than a center for music, trade, and worship. It stood as a remarkable feat of engineering and human creativity in one of the world's harshest environments. Without metal tools, wheels, or draft animals, its people built a lasting city of stone and earth nearly 5,000 years ago. Their accomplishments were extraordinary. Massive pyramids rose from the desert, assembled from huge stones carried using reed bags and strong plant-woven baskets. Structures were carefully layered with stone and filled with rubble, making them durable against both time and the elements. These builders had a deep understanding of their environment. Located in an earthquake-prone region, Chorale's monument survived due to their earthquake-resistant design, flexible methods, layered infill, wide bases, and rounded corners helped absorb seismic forces. This engineering wasn't derived from manuals, but from an intuitive knowledge of the land. Water management was another quiet innovation. Despite the desert setting, the inhabitants created advanced irrigation networks, guiding river water to nourish crops even during dry spells. Their planning was meticulous. Every drop was used efficiently. Chorale's layout displayed brilliant urban planning. Key buildings were aligned with astronomical events, reflecting a profound grasp of solar cycles. The precisely designed sunken plazas weren't just social spaces, they were tools for observing the sky and forecasting seasonal changes critical to agriculture. The city's organization revealed a sophisticated society, with residential, administrative, and ceremonial areas thoughtfully arranged to maintain balance and function. They lived in harmony, creating shared spaces with spiritual significance. Their construction efforts were not just for their time, but intended to last through generations. Modern engineers are awed by the endurance of this ancient place, realizing that true greatness isn't solely defined by technological advancement. Sometimes the deepest insight comes from aligning with nature rather than opposing it. The stones have withstood natural disasters, erosion, and time itself, standing as a quiet witness to a society that turned its aspirations into lasting structures in the desert. For centuries, the city thrived, peaceful, musical, engaged in trade, and marked by architectural brilliance. Then, almost imperceptibly, it was deserted. There was no sign of destruction, no evidence of conflict, no widespread death. It simply emptied, its public spaces silent, its buildings left to the elements, its music stilled. The reason for its abandonment remains a mystery. Some researchers point to environmental shifts, with drought possibly crippling agriculture and disrupting trade reliant on cotton and food surplus. The delicate balance with a harsh landscape may have finally been lost. Others suggest economic changes played a role. As neighboring regions gained prominence, the city's once crucial goods might have lost value, gradually weakening its influence. There are also theories of internal issues, perhaps political instability, spiritual upheaval, or the weariness of sustaining a long-standing society. Without written records, these remain educated guesses. The decline appears to have been slow, with families leaving over time, seeking more hospitable lands. The memory of the city lingered in stories before even those faded. Nature gradually reclaimed what was built. Sand covered the temples, and instruments lay buried beneath dunes. What was once a lively, thriving center became a field of quiet mounds. For thousands of years, the city remained hidden, nearly forgotten. It wasn't until the late 20th century that it was brought to light again. In the 1990s, an archaeological team ventured into the valley, curious about the rounded hills. Their discovery would transform the understanding of early societies in the Americas. Meticulous excavation revealed finely crafted stone structures, staircases, plazas, pyramids, forming a city older than anyone expected. Dating techniques confirmed its age. Over 4,600 years, contemporaneous with ancient civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. This breakthrough challenged long-held beliefs that complex societies in the Americas developed much later. The findings included musical instruments, fishing tools, textiles, and knot records, evidence of a thoughtful, organized, and artistic people. The city's rediscovery wasn't just a scientific milestone, it was the reawakening of a long-lost culture. Now recognized globally as a cultural treasure, the site serves as a fragile but vital connection to humanity's early ambition to create, connect, and believe. Hidden beneath sand for millennia, its stones persisted, waiting to be rediscovered. Today they speak again, telling a story that broadens our perspective on human history, one shaped not by conquest but by ingenuity, harmony, and enduring vision. Not of violence, but of unity, creativity, and aspiration. Long before the rise of the great empires of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt, the people of Corral were crafting something remarkable. They constructed pyramids without using the wheel. They charted the cosmos without written language. They built a flourishing culture grounded in commerce, music, ceremony, and engineering, all without the marks of warfare. In a time often remembered for strife, Corral presents an alternative path for civilization, one that prioritized connection over conquest, learning over control. It shows that sophistication doesn't need to be born from conflict, that true greatness lies not in the number of battles won, but in a community's power to build, create, and envision. Corral's influence stretches far beyond the arid terrain of the Soup Valley. It challenges long-held beliefs that civilization began in only one place, that urban development and grand architecture originated solely in the Old World. Corral demonstrates that human creativity and ambition emerged independently in different parts of the globe, guided by diverse hands, yet driven by the same timeless yearnings to survive, to celebrate, to touch the divine. Today, walking through Corral's time-worn remains, one can almost sense it. The rhythm of drums, the soft notes of flutes, the chatter of merchants in busy plazas, the laughter of children darting through stone corridors beneath an endless starlit sky. Their lives, their hopes, their voices linger still, carved into the land itself. Corral teaches us that even as civilizations fade, their essence can remain, resting beneath the earth, awaiting rediscovery, ready to inspire once more. In the vast story of humanity, Corral stands not only as a memory of the past, but as a guidepost for the future. A testament that even in barren deserts and beneath layers of time, the roots of wonder, knowledge, and harmony can grow and shape a world that dares to reach for the heavens.